I'm going to go ahead and jump into the presentation here. The first thing I want to cover is just some expectations for you so you're sure that you're in the class that you want to be in. We're going to be discussing how to maintain company standards, but from the perspective of not only protecting our company standards, but how do we give the user some ability to customize their own environment? Because let's face it, people like to work the way they like to work. And as long as we make our company standards easy to use and then give the user the ability to modify or tweak things to their satisfaction or to make their job easier, they're going to be much happier in the long run. So we're going to cover some techniques to discuss how we can support user files for plotting, because the obvious technique of putting the plotting support files up on the network introduces a problem, and we'll talk about that. I'll also go into just a few Visual Lisp code samples to indicate how we can use programming to help us enable the users and some techniques for that. So a little bit about myself. I'm the Design Technology Manager for Sparling. We're the largest U.S. electrical specialty firm. We also have in the audience our CAD manager right over here, but she's just going to sink in her seat, I'm sure. I was working for a mechanical electrical firm for 19 years, so I have a great deal of experience in CAD management side of things. I've been writing code for a long time. I've also been a director for Augie, and if you're not a member of Augie, did I mention Augie membership's free? So, just a little plug there. Now, I'm also up on the discussion groups quite often, both at Augie and at Autodesk, and that's my avatar in case you want to put a name to the face. I haven't been up in the Autodesk groups lately, and those of you that have been up in the Autodesk groups know why, because they're a disaster at the moment, but hopefully that'll get fixed. So anyway, you can definitely find me in the Augie discussion groups. And then I'm an active member in the beta programs and also an author. So I need to know a little bit about you first. How many people here, CAD management-wise, support just a single office? All right, a few of you. And then multiple offices, of course. Good number of you. All right, so how many years of experience in general do you feel that you have? Would you say that it's just a couple of years in the CAD management field, or are many people here been CAD managers for a long time? So long time. Oh, all right. So we've got actually quite a few people here that haven't been CAD managers for a long time. So this discussion ought to help enlighten you in some ways. So those of you, especially with multiple offices, do you have a good relationship with IT? Or is it one of those deals where you have to beg for things to get done? Okay. Well, some of the techniques that I'm going to cover do work better if you have some IT support for like login scripts, things to happen under that. But some of the techniques also you can actually execute within AutoCAD and perform many of the same functions and not rely so heavily on IT. But IT support definitely is a plus. So who here is comfortable with Visual Lisp or AutoLisp? All right, a few of you. So the code that I demonstrate, it's going to be very basic. So those of you that aren't familiar with it at all, it will give you a good boilerplate, an idea of where to go. And once again, I'm up on the discussion group. So if you have a question, get a hold of me there. Now, on your handouts, on the title page, is my email address at the very bottom of the... Okay. I don't know why they cut those off. They asked us to put them in there, and then they're all cut off. My email address is rbell@sparling.com, and at the end of the session, if I've got time, I'll put that up there for you. So you can get a hold of me that way also. So let's get into the discussion. There are files that are really user files because that's where they're placed by AutoCAD, but they're things that we want to control as CAD managers. In particular, fonts really fall into that definition. The fonts get installed at the local installation of AutoCAD, of course, but fonts are something we want to control. We want to make sure our entire office or our entire corporation has the same fonts and maps the same substitutions. Otherwise, we could have chaos when it comes to plotting time. Now, printer configuration files, those are also something that is placed on the local hard drive, and yet they're critical for us as CAD managers to be able to get plots out in a consistent manner. So we've got to be able to control those from the corporation perspective. And plot style tables go along with that. Now, the difficulty with those files is that if you put them up on the network, you're locking them down. So we'll touch how we're going to be able to get around that for our users. The custom dictionary, it's pretty simple and straightforward file, but quite often I think we have the tendency as CAD managers to forget about that file. So I'll just briefly discuss a way in which we can make sure that the user always has their custom words that go along with them, especially when it comes to upgrade time. The Acad.pgp file, that is probably your user's primary mechanism for customizing AutoCAD, what they call customizing AutoCAD. We know as CAD managers that all they're doing is just making a few aliases, but this file really does play an important role in making the users happy, so we'll discuss how we use that in a corporate environment. The Acad Lisp and doc file. Now, these files, I call them user files because quite often they wind up in the support folder for AutoCAD at the local station, but these files are crucial from the CAD management perspective. And as we go through the discussion, we're going to see why you don't want to relinquish control of those files. As a CAD manager, you've got to keep those under lock and key. The main CUI file, how many here attended the morning session for CUIs? Okay, I'm not going to go into a great amount of detail on that, but as we go through today's discussion, we'll just show how this main CUI file is something that's really intended for our users. And then a user Lisp file, how we can give the users the second boost in productivity to go from just the Acad.pgp to creating simple keyboard commands that will actually execute a full command as opposed to just starting a command. So, default locations. App data is used by the roaming profiles. Who here knows what roaming profiles are and has IT implemented them? Okay, only a few of you. Now, you probably wondered, those of you that have been longtime CAD managers, why in the world did they move the support files from this real nice visible location under program files to this really hidden folder way under the user's profile, and I've got to go searching for it? Well, it's because Autodesk, in maintaining compliance with Microsoft certification, requires that programs stuff their user customized files in a specific location, which starts with that app data. Now, I put %appdata% up here because at Windows Explorer, at the address bar, you can type that in and get to that location. And many of you probably didn't know that, but if we bring up Windows Explorer here, %appdata%, it flops over automatically to where the roaming profile starts. So my Autodesk stuff, you can see, is going to be located under the Autodesk folder. And from there I could get into the actual support folders and so forth. So any DOS environment variable that points to a path, you can use that % mechanism on. So I'm going to start a command prompt here. And under here, if I do a set command, any of these paths, I could do that. So you could do a %temp%, and no matter where temp is located, Windows Explorer will open to that location. So just a handy tip. Sometimes, people say, well, go to your temp folder, and you don't know whether that's C:\temp or user app data temp, temporary folder location, and so forth. So any of those, you can use that % mechanism on. So get rid of those. Now, another common location is the all users profile. So this is going to go into that all users support folder for AutoCAD stuff, and the plotter files are what you're going to find there by default. So obviously that's on the local drive. That's not going to help us much as CAD managers. We need to move those up to the network. And then program files. That's, of course, where the AutoCAD core files are going to be located, and those are files that should be rarely modified. It's interesting that Autodesk decided to put the fonts folder under there, because in a locked down IT environment, quite often program files is read-only to the users, so they couldn't add a font if their life depended on it. So we'll discuss how we get around that also. Now, centralized locations for the files make a lot of sense, both from the user's perspective and as having to support people. Primarily, when you have the files in a central location, you've got multiple logins. So you can log in at any workstation throughout the corporation and your settings will be there. That's the ultimate goal. That helps when it comes time to upgrade a computer. You've got updates that happen, the software has been updated, or there's some new service packs that get installed. It doesn't require rocket science to get all of those files back up, pointed on the network for those new versions of AutoCAD. And then finally, when it comes to time for a whole brand new workstation, when you've got all those files up on the network, especially the user's files, then it's just a matter of plugging in the software and starting. And your customizations and the user's customizations are there. So, fonts. Well, it makes sense to keep them on the network, obviously. There's something that we have to have available to people. Now, you can put SHX fonts up on the network, and they will be usable by people. And that will reduce the font substitution problem. However, TrueType fonts are going to be a problem. So there are some issues when you keep files up on the network for the shape fonts, for the text fonts. Performance is one. When you have 100, 200, 300 fonts, it's usually not a problem when it comes to performance. But if you've got 500 or 600 fonts, shape fonts, what happens is the first time that AutoCAD attempts to launch anything that deals with fonts, so that would be the style, mText, text command, any of those, it takes a while to read those. AutoCAD has to go out, find those files, and read them off the network and put them into memory, and from there they're available. So that first instance of any of those commands makes a discernible pause when you have a lot. Another issue is that sometimes, well, with eTransmit, you get the fonts along for the ride, and yet those fonts are often blindly just slapped into the project folder by the CAD specialist. They receive an eTransmit file that's got the latest updates for the background, included the fonts, we'll just unpack it all in there. So you can wind up with fonts that have the same name, but don't act the same, don't look the same. So those can be an issue. And then, of course, we described the problem of trying to get them stuffed into program files. If the user were to log into a computer under their normal login, and we tried to copy the fonts into their program files, they might not be able to get them because IT has locked that file to be read-only. So it becomes obvious that we have to have those in a different place. Now, also the issue of putting the files local is that you have to synchronize them. So when you've got changes to the fonts, you want to make sure that the users have those changes and that they don't have a bunch of old stuff that they don't need anymore. TrueType fonts, now that's a whole different beast. And some of you have probably run into this where, by golly, I just wanted to be able to put the fonts in a folder and have them available to everybody. But TrueType fonts have to actually be installed to the operating system. And there is code that can do that. However, the code also requires access to read-only areas of the registry when IT has locked that part of the functionality down. So even by trying to do it by code, you can still run into problems. So, some solutions. A network location is obviously the best option. And if you have a performance problem, then by all means replicate it to the hard drive. Make a specific folder on the hard drive for customizations that have to be synchronized and stuff it down there. And so IT can support that by a login script. Or if you can't get IT to do it for you, then in the Acad.lisp file, when AutoCAD first starts, you can tell it to copy all the files from a folder up on the network to a folder down on the local hard drive. And you can even have that Lisp routine check to make sure that the files are the same and so forth. So it's definitely possible to do from just the CAD management perspective, but of course that's going to take a little bit of time when AutoCAD first starts up. TrueType fonts, I mentioned that you have code, but it does take some IT support to avoid an issue in HKey local machine. Local machine is usually read-only to a restricted user, so they won't be able to have rights into that area. So, specify your font location if it's up on the network or a local cache folder and place it above the fonts folder that's located normally in the profile. That way those fonts will load first from there. And in fact, you can even remove the standard program files font folder out of there just so that you reduce the issue of fonts with the same name. Now the font mapping file, that's a single file, and it's going to list the fonts that you don't normally have on your system, but you want to substitute them for a specific font. So once again, when it comes to plotting for an organization, you want the user in Dallas to be able to plot exactly the same as the user in Seattle, so they've got to look at the same mapping file. So obviously that has to go up on the network also. There is no support for users to add something to that. If you're going to maintain control of the substitutions, it's up on the network, or it's a synchronized file, and if the user modifies the file, you're going to have to overwrite it the next time they log in anyway. So this is definitely an area where hopefully there's not a whole lot of font substituting going on, or your users are communicating to you when there are issues and you need to map them. And once again, you specify that option in the options dialog box. So, printer support files. Now, printing requires, in particular, two types of files: the printer configuration, or the PC3 file, and the description file. So the description file is created when you modify a sheet size to have custom margins, or you create a custom sheet size. And that file is created automatically. The file that's created automatically is stuffed into a location that's defined by the options dialog box. But I want to point out that that location is not necessarily where the file has to reside. It can actually be located in other spots. And we'll get into that in just a moment. Some of the issues that you're going to run into is that the PC3 file and the PMP file both are driver version specific. So you've got the same type of plotter in a couple of different offices, but IT hasn't kept the drivers up to date. So you could run into issues where the PC3 file doesn't recognize a different version of the driver. Even more important to recognize, though, is that they're operating system specific. So a Vista driver and an XP driver, although they may look exactly the same, the PC3 file and the PMP file will be different. And you will get some very odd issues if you use a PC3 file that was created for Vista and then tried to plot in XP. There's a question back there? The same thing. That's an operating system specific thing, so you definitely have to account for different bit versions. So the question was 32-bit versus 64-bit. Is there a difference between the drivers? Yes, there is. And here? AutoCAD versions. The question is, AutoCAD versions, is there a difference between them? No, there is not. Ever since AutoCAD 2000, when the plotting engine changed, as long as the driver version is the same, so the Heidi driver, if it's the same, you can use the same PC3 file. If the Heidi version changes, then that's a different. The Heidi version driver is usually, you can find that by just looking at the file name in the driver folder. It changes when the drawing file format changes, usually. Usually a Heidi driver changes when the drawing format changes. So given that Autodesk does a 3-year cycle on the driver version or the drawing version, then your Heidi driver is usually good for 3 versions. So page setups, they require those PC3 files. They rely on them. And so you've really got a juggling act when it comes to CAD management. If you're going to set up plotting to be easy for the users and you want to use page setups, well, they have to look at those PC3 files. So you can imagine that you've got a nightmare looming on the horizon. You've got 4 or 5 offices and 4 or 5 different driver versions, and does that mean that you're going to have to do 30 or 40 different page setups just to accommodate all the different offices and so forth? Well, we'll get into that. It's not so bad. Another issue, though, one that doesn't really get recognized sometimes, is that there can be network issues. Imagine that you have a page set up for Seattle that refers to the plotter in Seattle, and that's attached to a drawing on the network. And then the user in Dallas opens up that drawing. What happens? Well, what happens is that AutoCAD starts looking for the plotter information, and that's going all the way back up to Seattle. And so there's definitely a lag there where that plotter information is read from a remote office. And so you can generate some unintended network traffic when you have page setups that are tied specifically to certain offices. Once again, we'll get around that. And then, of course, updating drivers, that's an issue. So as a CAD manager, sometimes you're overworked and it's hard to keep those up to date, but it really is important. So, storing files on the network. It makes sense to put these plotter files up on the network. And as we go through this next part of the discussion, I'm going to recommend up front that you create folders based on the office location or the plotter location, and the operating system. When you have those multiple folders, it's going to be easy for you to segregate the plotter support folders or files for each of those unique circumstances. Now, I then, quite often in a multi-office environment, recommend the use of a generic name for the primary printers. So in Seattle, you have your main plotter. Doesn't matter what it is. We'll just call it main. It's the main plotter that everybody in Seattle is going to. Then in the Dallas office, the same thing. They're going to a plotter there in their office. So you call that plotter main. So you've got two PC3 files that are called main, but they're stored in different folders. So the Seattle office has its main in one folder, and the Dallas office has theirs in a separate folder. Now when AutoCAD starts, you simply tell AutoCAD to look at the right location, at the right folder for where that system is being started from. And then when a drawing loads up and it's looking for the main plotter, that's all it's looking for. It's looking for main. It's not looking for Seattle, Maine. So it says, okay, main is located in this Dallas folder. That's the folder I've got active. That's reduced your network traffic right there. Now, the page setups are key to that. Use the page setups to refer to those generic names. And from that point out, wherever that drawing's opened up, whether it was created in Seattle and opened up in Dallas, whether it was created in New York, and it doesn't matter because you've got those generic names. And when you open up that drawing anywhere on your network, it will look in the local area. So you specify the location of the printer files, and you want to do that using code. It is possible to set up unique profiles for each office and so forth, but if you've got a user that travels, so they're in Seattle one week and then they're down in San Diego the next week, well, if you were doing it just based off of profiles and they took their laptop with them, they would still be looking back up in Seattle because that's the profile they have. So instead, usually with IT, if you work with them, they usually know what office you're actually logging a computer in from. Quite often they'll have a separate IP range for each specific office, so they know where a computer is being logged in from. Knowing that, you can use code to help you identify what office that computer is being logged in from and set the option at that point. Now the PMP files, I talked about how they're stored using the options dialog box. The location is specified, but this point is rarely known, that the location of the PMP inside of the PC3 file is hard-coded. So you've got the options dialog box where you can change the path. And you decide after you've created a bunch of PC3 files that you don't like the path where the PMP file is located, so you just change it in the options dialog box and you think you're good to go. No, that's not true, because the PC3 file is hard-coded where that original PC or PMP file is located at. So you actually have to go into the PC3 editor and detach the old one and then attach the new one at its proper location in order to wake those up. So My recommendation in that case is that you put all the PMP files into just one folder, and then you modify your PC3 files so that they're all pointing into that one single folder. Now, hopefully that single folder is replicated by IT to the local offices, so there's not a lot of network traffic going back to just one mothership office. In most cases, IT's got a system set up for that. Any questions about the PC3 and the PMPs? Because those are really an area that can catch you if you're not doing a setup. Oh, here, please. Okay.
So with the PMP, it has to go back to the network because that's where they were originally set up?
Okay, the question was that they have the PC3 files and the PMP files set up originally on the network and you sync it down local?
Yeah, we move it down to the...
Right, okay. And then as soon as you sync it down local, yeah, the PC3 file is actually looking back up at the network for their PMP file. Doesn't matter if you copy the PMP file local, or even if it's in the support folders. It's hard-coded, so... Could it be a cause for the computers to crash? Well, if the PMP files, if you've got multiple differences in operating versions, operating systems or drivers, there could be a cause there, although usually you're just going to get an alert that there's a bad driver. So... Okay, well, lots of work there, I guess. Send me an email later and we'll try to work that out for you. Any other questions on that? Okay. So you could go ahead and specify the options for the PMP file, and I definitely would point that to the network. Our really old CAD manager, not the one that's nicely sitting here, but a really old CAD manager had the location pointed in a bad spot, and then he thought it was Autodesk's fault that the PMP files were always going to the wrong spot, and no, it was him all along. So, but I never told him that. Shh. So, now, we've been talking about the network folders, or network support for plotting. But occasionally you have a user that's got a printer right next to them, right? So wouldn't they like to be able to use that printer? Well, you can use shortcuts to actually point to other locations in the printer folder itself, and those shortcuts are honored. And so printers that are defined in that local folder are available to the user in their list. They'll see the PC3 files appear simply due to that shortcut being there. So with that shortcut enabled, that gives the user the ability to create their own local printer and be able to pick that right off of the list. Now, the problem here is that you want to make sure that that shortcut points to a valid location. Because imagine what the operating system does when it finds a shortcut and it says, okay, I need to go find the printer folder at Acad.temp, and it doesn't exist. It sits there and searches for about a minute due to network lag time until it finally decides that, well, that doesn't exist anymore, and then it displays the plot dialog. I.e., that means a bunch of unhappy users. So in our circumstance, we make sure that when we add the shortcut to our printer folder, that we always have that folder location on the local hard drive. And we use code in the ACAD list file to just make sure it exists. And if it doesn't exist, create the folder. It's as simple as that. So plot styles, they act in a similar way. Once again, we want to enforce Office standards, so those plot styles should absolutely be up on a network folder. And when you do that, you specify the location for the plot styles in the options dialog box, and I would once again recommend code to enforce that profile every time AutoCAD starts. The nice thing, though, about plot styles is that you can, once again, add a shortcut in the network folder that points to a local location, and the user can plop in those plot style tables that they get from an architect to plot the background exactly as the architect wants. Or if you've got a contract where the client wants a specific plot style set just for a specific project, you can take care of that by pointing to those local locations. And because of that shortcut, that appears in the list of plot styles. So, up to this point, we've been discussing files that have been in the all users profile area, and we've also discussed the files that belong in program files. But now we get down to the stuff that is in the support folder, which is in the roaming area for the users. So the first question you have to ask is, well, does IT implement roaming profiles? And from what I saw here, not many places have. The advantage to IT implementing the roaming profiles is that, in theory, the user can log out of his computer at one station, go to another station, log in, and his roaming profile has been replicated up on the network, and when he logs in, boom, it's there for him on that new station. It's slick technology, but there are a few issues when it comes to CAD support with that, and I'll talk in that just briefly. So, the CAD manager. Does the CAD manager have rights into the replicated folder? When IT implements the roaming profiles, typically that's going to go to the user's home folder, their home directory, and usually the CAD manager doesn't have rights there. So you have all these support folders that all of a sudden the CAD manager can no longer touch, and that's a bad circumstance to be in. As a CAD manager, you've relinquished control, you can't touch it anymore, you can't help your user, you can't see what's going on. So it's a bad idea to actually have those replicated under the home folder. But you definitely want to have the ability to do something similar to that so that people can log in anywhere. And the new station upgrades. So what are our alternatives? Well, you can provide a user folder under a central location and not in the home folder system, but have IT create one for just AutoCAD support or configuration. And from this point out, I'm going to refer to that as the user's network folder. This is going to be just as if their support folder from the hard drive is copied up to the network in this location. And from there on out, they can get to their files. And you, as a CAD manager, are able to go in, because you have rights assigned, to go in and look at those files and modify them if need be or help the user out. So you definitely, when you create that folder, want to make sure that IT is giving you rights to be able to go in and modify it. And also have the ability to create those folders when they're missing. So you want to use that to avoid the issue of the shortcuts pointing to a location that doesn't exist, for example. And when you automatically create the folder if it's not there, then that gives you a little bit more control as a CAD manager, because when AutoCAD is deployed, quite often as a CAD manager, sometimes you have the ability to go in and modify parts of the deployment package, but sometimes IT doesn't give you a whole lot of choice. They're doing a group policy deploy or something along those lines. So you sometimes have to do a lot of work after that initial installation. And code definitely gives you the ability to create all of this support stuff and have that automatically occur when there's a new station that's set up. So you want to specify this user's network folder above the out-of-the-box files so that it's going to be found first when AutoCAD is searching for files, as opposed to looking at the local hard drive. Because IT in the group policy deploy is going to stuff down just the normal out-of-the-box stuff into the user's local support profile. So when you get that support, the network folder up there above it, that's going to be found first. And so one of the files that you would want up there is the custom dictionary. Now, there's a couple of different approaches when it comes to the custom dictionary, and both of them have pluses and minuses, just like anything in life. So a central file, well, that's going to keep everybody consistent. So you as a CAD manager can go in and make sure that all the words that are allowed in that custom dictionary are specifically the ones that you permit, and then you can make it read-only, so that's going to prevent the user from adding any bad definitions. But how much work do you want to do? You know, you might wind up with quite a list of, well, we need this word added or that word added, and for a while you could be doing a lot of editing in that custom dictionary. So it just depends on what your workload is and what you're willing to take on. So if the users can't add the word, you have to add it. Now, another option is to locate their custom dictionary in a personal location, the user's network folder. And so now the user has a personal dictionary. And this might not be as bad as it sounds, because the user dictionary is actually just a text-based file. So you can create a boilerplate version of the user dictionary, has all the words in it that you know you need to have by default. And then when a new installation of AutoCAD happens, a new user comes online, just have that copied into their folder, and so they've got the basic set of words. And from that point out, they can add their own words. And even better is that knowing that it's just a text file, if down the road you know you need to add some words to everybody's user's dictionary file, once again, a little bit of code goes a long way, because it's a text file. You can open it up, stuff in some words, and close the file, and they've now got the new words. So it's definitely a viable technique to have it even in the user's file. You can still maintain some good control over that. So that custom dictionary, once again, that's assigned in the Options Files dialog box, and you can have code enforce that if you wish. So the Acad.pgp, this is probably the file that's used most by the average user to customize their AutoCAD. So they're going to add in their command aliases and so forth. The disadvantage to the Acad.pgp, though, is that it's kind of showing its age. It's one file, it's a text-based file, but there's no way for the CAD manager to attach another Acad.pgp. So it's not as if you can have an office version of the aliases and then the user have their own version of the aliases, which is at a disadvantage, especially when it comes to upgrade time. Because imagine that the user has customized their own Acad.pgp file, and now you've got some new aliases that come with the latest version of the software. How do you get those to the user? So unfortunately, this file is definitely showing its age when it comes to this sort of issue. There is definitely talk of rolling this into the CUI at some point. So it might, once again, roll under that enterprise system, which would be a real benefit. So we can only hope that happens somewhere in the near future. Now, you want to provide the location for the Acad.pgp before the default one that's installed in the support folder. So you definitely want to have that user's network folder located before the out-of-the-box version of support in the options dialog box. That way their version gets loaded first. And I put this one up here because there's not a lot of people that know this. And let's actually flip over to AutoCAD here. Or let's see, I'm actually in the support folders here, so we'll go look at it directly. So I'm going into the support folder, and we're going to look at Acad.pgp in my text editor. And in most cases, people take this file and, let's see, how many hate see a circle? Okay, come on, admit it. So they go down here and they find C and they change that gosh darn thing over to copy. Well, it's right there. Why not change it? And they never ever see that at the very bottom of the file that there's a section here for user-defined aliases. So please, please, please train your users to put their customizations at the bottom of the file. There's two reasons for that. Number one is if you rely on migration to update AutoCAD, it's going to read all of this stuff up above and replace it with the new versions, aliases, until it gets down to the bottom, and then it keeps the user's customizations alone, leaves them there. Most of us are CAD managers, though, so we're not relying on migration to do our work for us. So the second reason why you want to have those aliases down there is because as a CAD manager, once you get an updated version of AutoCAD and you need to stuff some aliases in, you can parse through the file using code and get to where you need to put that definition in and fix the user's Acad.pgp file so that they have the updated aliases, but you haven't touched their own. You don't have to do an overwrite of the file or anything like that. That way you know that their definitions are alone at the bottom. And the reason that works is because the last loaded definition wins. So if you put a C copy at the bottom of this file, it's going to be C equal copy. All right, so back over to PowerPoint. Yeah, question?
If you use express tools in AutoCAD, they just modify they don't go to the user.
That's oh, I didn't know that. That's okay. The comment up here at the top, or up at the front, was there's a command alias edit that the users quite often use to edit the Acad.pgp file because it makes it easy. And I was just informed that using that does exactly what it's not supposed to do. So I'm going to talk to the programmers on that one. Yeah, they should absolutely be stuffing those down at the bottom. Is that what? Yes, that's the Express Tools version of the editor. Way in the back there.
Keep referring back to the user's home page. We've got stuff on the network that points back to the user's home. What you're going to show us up here, it sounds like I'm going to be going to every computer to make these changes individually.
That's a good point. Do you have to, as a CAD manager, go in and make all of this stuff happen by hand? And no, if you've got any experience writing code at all, it's really easy to implement that. The handout shows some cases of loading up a user Lisp file, for instance, towards the end of the handout. There is also definitely the opportunity for you to get a hold of me just to describe that in more detail. I didn't want to make this a code class because, frankly, code after 1 p.m. at lunch puts people to sleep. Yes, it's absolutely doable. I hate to work hard, so we do that in our office all the time. If we've got a new user comes online or I make changes, it's all code-based. And it's just a few lines of code to write and you're done with it. So, moving in that direction, talking about code, Acad.lisp and Acad.doc.lisp. These aren't user files. Don't let the user try to create an Acad.lisp file and use that. And the reason for that is because there is just far too much value to you as a CAD manager to enforce standards using these files. And when you let the user have an Acad.lisp file, well, you've just given up all control because they can take control of their profile and you have no hope for that. So, there's no good reason to give the users those files. And in fact, it would be a wise idea just to make sure, occasionally audit, to make sure that those files don't exist in their user folders. But the best way to do that is to load the Acad.lisp files from a network location that is in the support folder path above the users folders. So it's going to get found first. Now, in the Acad.doc.lisp, by all means, provide some support for the user who wants to create Lisp files on their own. Give them a plug-in, so to speak, that allows them to get their code loaded. It's a tough line you walk as a CAD manager. I know very well the pain of the rogue user out there doing things his own way. But there are definitely a lot of advantages to having a good user being able to customize the environment the way that they want. And quite often, they're going to come up with something that makes sense for the company. And so you've just gotten some code for free from them because, well, they're on the company clock. They can't copyright it. So it's yours. So it's definitely something I would encourage the use of. Now, quite often, here at AU even, you will have people that talk about loading a user Lisp file, and they show it being loaded directly from Acad or Acad.doc.lisp. And I strongly discourage that. You want to make sure that you use the s:\startup function to load the user's Lisp routines. And we're also going to go into a bit more detail on that startup routine and why even as a CAD manager you want to use that. So occasionally we'll find people that talk about editing the ACAD 2000X files or the ACAD 2000X doc files. And I know why that happens. It's because ACAD.lisp and ACAD.doc.lisp are user-created files. They don't exist out of the box. So you, as a CAD manager or your users, go to try to edit an ACAD Lisp file. They can't find it. So they find this ACAD 2000 Lisp file and start merrily editing it. But Autodesk has a technical support document that talks about the load order. And these two files listed here, the ACAD 2000 and 2000X doc files, those are for Autodesk use. There is no guarantee that when you get an update that they're not going to overwrite those files. Any update that comes down the road can blow those files away. Do not stuff your own code in there. Do not let your users stuff their own code in there. They're going to lose it at some point if they get an update or run the risk of that. So by all means, make sure that you create just an ACAD or an ACAD doc Lisp file instead. And refer to that document. It talks about the load order of the files, which is interesting to see too. So, the user Lisp file, I definitely suggest training the users in how to do this. If you don't know how to create a command function in Visual Lisp as a CAD manager, I strongly suggest that you get a little bit of training here at Autodesk University or on the discussion groups. It's very easy to create these. And as a CAD manager, when you know how to create these and you communicate that to your users, you're just opening up a world of productivity for them. Well, yeah, you'll have some people that are in there all the time writing code and thinking they're really good at it, but you have to keep control of those particular users on a different level. So locate the user's Lisp file, obviously up in the user's network folder. So it's going to be always available to them no matter what workstation they log into, no matter if they get a new one or not. And then in the startup function, I recommend loading the user Lisp file somewhere towards the end. And the reason for that is because quite often these command functions are ones that the user wants to use for their own keyboard shortcuts to do something. And so they want to override your definition of LI and do something differently with it. So if you load their user Lisp too soon and then you stuff in your corporate definitions for the line command, LI shortcut, well, they're unhappy then. So load it towards the end, but definitely don't leave it as the last item because then they're just going to overwrite everything. So you want to make sure that for your critical items from a CAD manager perspective, load those at the very last of the startup function. But give the user at least a chance to overwrite some of the non-essential things. So this same concept of the user Lisp file can actually be extended even to project-by-project basis. So let's say that you have a client that has specific requirements for the drawings in the set. And when you, in the startup files, the ACAD doc file, when you look to see if a project file exists and you're in the right folder and you load that Lisp file, it could go in and check the drawing for you automatically, make sure that things are set up right for that particular client. So there's a lot of functionality available to you when, in your startup functions, you provide that support for looking at a project Lisp file. And the way that you do that is when the drawing gets opened up, you just examine the DWG prefix system variable. When you see that and it matches the correct folder and you can find a project Lisp file in that folder, then you run it. It's as simple as that. So I'm going to swap over briefly to a sample here of an ACAD.doc.lisp. And this is a very basic one, but it's showing how to look for a user Lisp file and then the mechanism of stuffing it into that startup routine. So the first line of code there, I'm using a defun queue. Who here knows what a defun queue is versus a defun? One person. This is an important distinction. The old days of Lisp, AutoLisp, a defun created a list. The command was actually a list of instructions. It was truly a list. But when Visual Lisp came out, defun creates a compiled function. So it's no longer a list. It's a function that executes exactly the same, but it's not a list that AutoLisp can look at. And so defun Q maintains that old legacy behavior. And the reason why that's an advantage to you is because then you can use that list and append it to your existing function. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. So then the second statement there, the condition statement, I'm checking to see if a user Lisp file exists. So if I can find that user Lisp file, I'm going to then subsequently load it right here. Now I want you to note that in this first line here that I'm setting a variable, user Lisp, to the location that it finds for the user file. Just in case the user's got it in a location that's a little odd, the load command will still execute it from that location instead of finding it in a different spot. And then I set that variable to nil. Now I have not localized that function, and that's because I'm executing this function in another function. Oh, look it. Good eye. All right, well, here, I got a prize for you. See me afterwards. Then the print statement just tells the user that their tool has loaded and I get out of the function. So here's the meat of the loading process. S:\startup is a special function that executes by AutoCAD after AutoCAD has quieted down. So you open up AutoCAD, and the command line usually becomes active at some point during the loading process, but it's not done yet. Palettes are still being loaded, ribbons are being exposed, blah, blah, blah. There's a whole lot of stuff that's going on. But the command line has become active. And so quite often what you'll find is that people will start using the command function to start setting up the drawing environment. But AutoCAD really hasn't finished stuff yet. And when you start using command functions in your startup routines, you can quite often run up AutoCAD into a state where it's not happy, because those commands are trying to execute when AutoCAD's really not ready yet. But that's avoided by using the S:\startup. That function doesn't execute until AutoCAD is finally quiet and the drawing is ready to start accepting commands finally. So all the palettes are loaded, the ribbons are loaded, everything else, AutoCAD is finally just ready for input. And that's when you want those functions to execute. Because quite often, the user is going to use the command function, just like you, the CAD manager, are going to use the command function. So you definitely want AutoCAD quiet at that point. And that also gives you the advantage of being able to make sure that a drawing isn't marked as being modified after AutoCAD launches. And we'll get into that in just a few moments also. So we talk about CUI files as being a class to themselves, and I'm absolutely positively honest about that because, well, I taught it this morning. So if you want to know more about CUI files in a CAD management perspective, definitely go to AU Online, AU.com, and download the handouts. And once again, I'm always up on the news groups. There's plenty of questions regarding the CUI in a corporate environment. So I'm always up there to give some advice in that area. The main CUI file should be something that's available to the user, something that they can modify. And the reason for that is because the main CUI file is how the user can set up the environment the way that they like. Most of us here probably have multiple monitors, right? Our office has installed them. And so the users want to have the toolbars on one monitor versus the other. And so as a CAD manager, you can't force them to always have everything docked into one window. They're going to hate you. So you definitely want to leave this main CUI file open so that they can make those modifications themselves. Now, the location for that CUI file, and the name is specified in the options file dialog box. But you definitely have control as a CAD manager using the Acad Lisp file to make sure that it's the right file that's loaded there, so the user doesn't change that around on you. And when you give the user the ability to modify their own main CUI file, it opens up a whole world for them, because they can create their own menu macros, their own commands. Obviously, you want to train them in how to do that, or they're going to spend some time, spin some wheels figuring it out. But once they start creating these own commands, they're able to create their own keyboards, shortcuts, their own toolbars, ribbon panels, and so forth. So they can really tweak the environment to the tasks that they do on a normal basis. As a CAD manager, we can't make everybody happy. So the purpose of this is to give them the ability to have control of that themselves. Now, obviously that means that you're giving up some ability to enforce the standards with the thumb hard on the standard, but you can always get the users back to the corporate standards by means of the enterprise CUI file. So you don't have to have that heavy-handed approach. They can customize their environment the way that they like, but you can always get them back to what needs to be done. And so the icons for their folders, or for their CUI files, have them locate those in a single folder. There's no need for them to copy icons from one version to the next. They're almost always going to keep the same icon from 2008 to 2010, whatever. So in the options dialog box, you can certainly point those icons into that specific single folder. So I've been talking about altering the profile. And here's where we kind of get back to that conversation there in the back from the gentleman in the back there. That how do I do that? Well, network deployment really can't modify the user-specific stuff. Usually that's done by a group policy or some other mechanism, and so the files are already there. So you have to do this after that initial deployment. So usually what I'll do in our code is in the Acad Lisp file, which executes when AutoCAD starts, and detect that I'm running in a default condition. In other words, my support folders haven't been loaded up yet, and that sort of thing. So when I know that's going on, then I can execute code that will allow us to stuff in the correct support folders and everything else from that point out. And that's for the Acad Lisp file, so that initializes AutoCAD when it first starts up. The Acad.pgp file is going to modify your environment every time a drawing loads. So that's where you would set up drawing-specific settings. Your profile-specific settings, you really only usually need to do that once when AutoCAD starts up. But there are definitely things that you want to have happen every time in a drawing. So I mentioned not to use the system variable Acad Lisp as doc. This was a kludge that, in my opinion, should have never been introduced in AutoCAD 2000. But it allows a CAD manager to tell AutoCAD that Acad.lisp should act just like Acad.lisp. In other words, Acad Lisp is going to load with every drawing. Now, the reason why it's a kludge is because how hard is it to copy the file and rename it to Acad.doc? Well, it's really, 10 seconds and you've got Acad and Acad.doc. And the reason why it's a kludge on top of that is because Acad Lisp is really useful to load things that only have to be done once in the drawing session. For instance, VBA applications or .NET files. Those only have to be loaded once AutoCAD starts, and once they're loaded, they're available for every drawing that's open from that point out. So why would you want to load them every drawing? Why would you want to inflict that network traffic? There's no need to do that. So definitely make sure that you're not running that Acad Lisp as doc. You give yourself back that control, that ability to do things in two different ways. So specify your company support folders definitely before your network or your user's network folder. That gives you ultimate control over what's going on. And that way the users still get their customizations, but you can enforce things. Now, that being said, there are users out there that are pretty smart. and you can't prevent somebody from hijacking your profile. You just can't do it. There's going to be somebody out there that's going to do it at some point, and you can try as hard as you want to prevent that from happening, but it's going to happen. So really, what it boils down to as a CAD manager is that you have to find out the reason why the user's hijacking your profile. They've either got a really good reason or they've got a really bad reason. The good reason is that, well, there's something you need to change as a CAD manager because it's inflicting pain upon your users. But if it's a bad reason, well, you're going to have to correct them somehow. They're either not fitting in with the corporate environment, then it's time to start escalating things a bit there. So definitely find out the reason why somebody has hijacked that profile. Now, occasionally, you're going to have files that you definitely need to have off of the network. And I mentioned 3 of them right here. VBA projects, .NET files, and resource library files. All 3 of these files, when AutoCAD loads them up, even if they're in a read-only folder to the user, the network leaves a file handle open on the files. They're read-only to the user. They can't modify them, but the network has opened up a handle on it. And it doesn't close that handle. So, especially if you've got VBA projects, you run into a real bad circumstance real quick because you've got to modify the code, but you've got 100 users loading that file. You'll never, ever get the handles closed fast enough to update your file. So you're either working at 2 a.m. in the morning when nobody else is on the network, and frankly, that sucks, or yeah, just kill AutoCAD. Just kill the license, and then they can't open up AutoCAD at all. Neither of which is really good. So what you want to do is actually copy those files down to a local network location and load them from there. So you have your Acad list or your startup functions, find the files at the local cache and load them from that point up. And that gives you the ability to modify the files in the central network location, and it's the caching mechanism that's going to copy those files down local. The question here in the front is that you can't copy over them, so you're stuck. Well, that's not true if you're copying the files before they get loaded. So in the login scripts, you copy the files at that point. AutoCAD's always open on their machines. So they go home on the weekend and they're always... sooner or later... Okay, well, it's a good point. It's a good point. Some users just run AutoCAD forever. However, how many people here have never experienced a crash with AutoCAD? Really? How long have you been using AutoCAD? How long have you been using AutoCAD? Oh, no, how many years? Okay, yeah. All right. So eventually a crash is going to happen. Sooner or later they're going to reset anyway. So can you force AutoCAD to crash? Oh yeah, there's all sorts of ways you can force AutoCAD to crash. I do it all the time. I wish I didn't know how to do it so much. No, a remote user, well, kill their remote connection. There's all sorts of ways in which you can handle that. You can close their license down, and they'll get a license timeout, and eventually they're able to save the files when they get the license timeout, but they have to restart AutoCAD. They're in the very back, please. I'm sorry, what? Even if the file is open, you're allowed to rename it. That's true, but the problem occurs that you, and I've had this happen in our own office on our older versions before I came along. We've got this exact circumstance, and yeah, you can rename the file, but you can never get the original file name back because somebody's always got it open. So your code's never loading because, well, you've got the modified code under the renamed file, but they've still got the handles open, so you can't copy over the file. Well, these are file handles that are being held open by the server, so you don't have much control as a CAD manager usually. You have to call up IT and please close the handles down, but somebody opens up AutoCAD right in the middle of them closing the files down. And actually, Microsoft Server has this really nasty system for doing that. When they find the file file handle they have to close down, they delete that file, and there's a bunch of them in that list. Well, it goes back up to the top of the list, so they have to scroll back down to the file handle, delete the next one, scroll back down to the next one. So IT really hates me when I call them up and say, "Can you close down the file handles?" So you definitely want to try to avoid that by using a caching mechanism. And the login script is the best way to make sure those files are up to date down on the local computer. So, and then of course load them from that local cache. Now environment variables. There's two different approaches to making sure that your code is portable enough that if IT changes their server name or something like that, that you can make sure that your code executes on the new server. The simplest mechanism, I'll admit, is inside your ACAD Lisp file to just set some environment or set some system variables so that they point to the current location. And so all you have to do is go into that Lisp file and change the file locations, and then the rest of your code is going to look at those file locations and load them from there. Enother approach, though, is to actually set it in the login script as a DOS environment variable. And you can use the get environment, GET-ENV function inside of Autolisp, and it will load that up as a path and execute it. So that has the advantage of having a little bit more IT support and changing those things. So definitely want to use a variable when you're loading files, because that gives you the ability to handle circumstances that are going to change on you. For some reason, Microsoft decides that we can no longer create folders at the root of C, so we have to put them somewhere else. You know, things like that. So anytime you're going to load files from the corporate perspective, definitely use an environment variable to store that file location so you can do the update in one spot. Where are those stored? There's two places. You can put these variables in acad.lisp or acaddoc.lisp so that they're available. In fact, let me flip over and show that. Here in our user support folders here, right here, I set some paths for us. And I'm actually using Blackboard variables. Now, this is a functionality that came along with Visual Lisp. And a Blackboard variable, these VLBB sets, those Blackboard variables, you set them once, and they're available no matter what drawing gets opened. So Autolisp was always written from a single drawing perspective. It always had to reload from drawing to drawing to drawing. So your variables from one drawing wouldn't automatically be available in the second drawing. Well, the Blackboard allows you to do that sort of mechanism. But they definitely have a different language to them, or a different way of setting them up. You have to use quoted functions and that sort of thing. If you want to explore that further, please, by all means, contact me and I'll show you how to set those up. So that's one mechanism. The other mechanism is that you have IT modify the registry so that you have DOS environment variables. So in my case, let's see. In my case here, we've got a folder or a environment variable set for the, oh man, yeah. So here we've got environment variables for the home path. So I can look at that and tell what location my user files are located at. And notice too that we have a log office C file. So my laptop knows that it belongs to Linwood, and that's where it's loaded from. And that's a way in which IT can really help you out as a CAD manager by giving you these environment variables that you can use that get-in function to load from. All right, so back over here. Now, this one is one that is so easy to fix, and I'm really surprised when it occurs. But save changes to drawing 1. Once as CAD managers we start modifying the environment, all of a sudden drawing 1 is always modified. The user just opened it up, just started AutoCAD, and that blank drawing, gosh darn it, says it's got to be modified and I have to save changes. Well, it's true that we want to set up things for the drawing file, but we still want to treat it as a blank drawing. So are we stuck by modifying the drawing and yet we don't really want to mark it as modified? Well, no, we're not. because for years we've had this function available. Use ACAD push db mod and use that as your first statement in acad.doc.lisp. Now this doesn't work in ACAD because ACAD only loads when AutoCAD first starts. You want this to run every time a new drawing gets open. So you want it in acad.doc.lisp. You want it to be the first function because the second you start modifying things, the database knows it's modified. So when AutoCAD doc, ACAD docs loads up first, it reads that and it says, well, this drawing doesn't have any modifications yet. So it stuffs that setting, that 0 setting, into a special location. And then, near the end of your startup function, you pop that variable back out. And so this db mod variable is read-only normally. But Autodesk programmers have given us the capability of, in this circumstance, using this code to push that 0 value into the stack and then pop it back out and make that drawing pretend that it's been unmodified. So your users no longer have to run into that issue of drawing 1's been modified and I didn't change it. So, load order. You want to use ACAD Lisp to load your VBA or your .NET stuff. You want to use ACAD doc or menu Lisp files to load stuff for every drawing. And then use the startup function every time you've got something that uses that command function. And I'll just briefly pop over to our functions down here. And all of the code, for instance, this profile tweaks up here, this is where we enforce the company standards. So this Lisp code executes every time that AutoCAD first initializes, and I force things to be correct. So the user has no chance to permanently modify the profile in those particular areas. And then we get down here to the startup function. So this is where I start doing all the drawing modifications. And you can see there that I am doing all of the profile tweaking there and setting up the db mod variables. So our drawing is going to eventually open up as an unmodified drawing. All right. Oh, and don't overwrite. I have to come back here. Don't overwrite SS startup. You want to append the functions. If you don't know how to do this, it's documented in the help files. It's not very explicit, so please contact me if you have any questions about it at all. But I have seen so many installations messed up because they simply did a defun s: startup and overwrote the original function. And that's a problem with the verticals, because quite often the vertical packages do use this function to start loading up some stuff. And so they couldn't figure out why some of their functionality in the vertical wasn't working. It was because they were overwriting some of the startup. So you always want to play nice. Put your stuff at the end of the file, just append it to the end of the file, and then you're not messing with AutoCAD startup. So, in summary, mini files should be located up on the network, and you definitely want to use shortcuts to help enable that plotting support so that users can have their own customized files at the local station or on their user network folder, and they always get those files. And that user network folder, it certainly gives you a mechanism to help the user from migration periods. They get the new version of AutoCAD, everything's still there, they don't lose it all. And it eases your pain also. Use your ACAD Lisp and ACAD doc to do the functions they're intended for, and S startup is still a very crucial function. You definitely want to use that. And then, of course, future-proof yourself. Make sure that you're using some sort of variable to store your folder paths. And you don't have to start AutoCAD with a modified file. So, that's it. I thank you for your attention. Now we'll have a Q&A. So, thank you again. Thank you.